In this video, we show some impractical spacecraft ideas, presented by NASA, and facts about the simulations of trips to the Moon. On the screen, we have two drawings, made to illustrate that, to land on the lunar soil, any rocket or spacecraft first need to make one turn of, until, 180 degrees, normally having only one propellant. The spacecrafts that will shown would have this difficulty. This is a NASA drawing, made around 1960, of two manned spacecraft that would land on the Moon, after being propelled from Earth by rockets. Before landing, they need to rotate, up to 180 degrees, as explained. Landing is difficult, as the astronauts are on top, with little view of the lunar soil. The jet locations, near to the soil, can cause instability. The project seeks to show the advantages of Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, or LOR, compared to direct landing. For the LOR, the smaller spacecraft takes off from the Moon, with two astronauts, enters lunar orbit, and docks with the command module, to return to Earth. For all maneuvers, that smaller spacecraft must perform similarly to a flying saucer. One spacecraft is much larger than the other, but both must have enough fuel for the descent and subsequent ascent. The smaller spacecraft does not show space for the necessary fuel. In 1960, a group from NASA, led by engineer Robert Gilroth, presented this drawing, representing two ideas for manned spacecraft, to land on the Moon. The spacecraft on the right has characteristics and defects similar to those already shown. The spacecraft on the left has jet for landing that it is not aligned with the center of gravity of the spacecraft, and the heaviest part, which appears to be the rear, could fall before the rest. The group of von Braun, at NASA, did this drawing, in January 1961. Two rockets land on the Moon. One with two astronauts, and other with fuel, to the rocket of the astronauts. The difficulties mentioned is doubled, as they are two rockets.
Here we have a study, by the group of Robert Gilroth, in 1960, on the positions of three astronauts, within the command module. The accommodations would be inadequate, for three astronauts going to the Moon and return. The permanence inside of this modulo was expected to take until 14 days, as in Apollo 1. The arrow shows the local of something like a bathroom.
By August of 1959, NASA create two committees, aiming studies of rendezvous maneuvers in space, both chaired by Dr. John Houbolt. The drawing seen here was made in 1961, by one assistant of Houbolt. The idea was that two little crafts would be propelled to the Moon, using the Earth orbit rendezvous. John Houbolt did not like the idea of using two crafts and made a derogatory comment. He made a sketch for the lunar orbit rendezvous, of a ship, seen enlarged on the right side. Life magazine commented that, this sketch was very similar to one used in the Apollo program. The truth is that, the lunar module, of Apollo is very different, because it has two parts, as we show in the next screen.
According to Life magazine, the drawing on the left is a model of the Lunar Module, made in 1962, by Grumman aircraft, that is held by paper clips. The Lunar Module was the most problematic spacecraft in the Apollo program. But after debating the law since 1959, this model reveals the lack of good ideas that time. In the right is the final Lunar Module, with 2 parts. It is not worth ask for why it has 2 parts, because it has never been in the moon. It also never made any controlled flight from the terrestrial soil. Besides, it is unsafe and does not fly.
Bill Kaysing was the first author to denounce the Apollo program fraud, with the book We Never Went to the Moon. The book was published in 1976, and has had several reprints. One of the published covers is shown here. Here we have photos of some book covers, and an old photo of Kaysing. He graduated in English literature in 1949. From February 1956 to May 1963, he worked at Rocketdyne, which was a division of North American Aviation, and from 1967 passed to Rockwell. At Rocketdyne, Saturn V rocket engines were designed and built. Kaysing was a technical writer, and then head of publications. He was responsible for interpreting technical data into lay language on the performance of propellants, engines, and rockets, in order to obtain government funding. He witnessed many more failed tests than anyone could have imagined.
By knowing in practice, Kaysing was more aware than any theoretical expert about the results of tests with rockets ordered by NASA, in the period that the definitions of the spaceships and components of the Apollo program were made. When the success of the Apollo 11 mission was announced in 1969, he did not believe it. He discovered that the astronauts, who he called astronauts, during the supposed trip to the moon, stayed in a reserved place in the Las Vegas area.
The Apollo Simulation Project, with the acronym ASP, was created to execute a simulation plan. According to Kaysing, in 1961, the ASP already existed, being controlled by the Defense Intelligence Agency. With the acronym DIA, which was planned to supposedly help NASA with its technical problems, but establishing a fully simulated lunar mission. He even discovered the amounts these departments spent.
A moon landing? What moon landing? The screen shows part of that article, published on December 18, 1969, in the New York Times. The article reported that, in Chicago bars, some people commented that the Apollo 11 moonwalk was actually staged by Hollywood, at a location in the Nevada desert. This is the same conclusion as Kaysing, and therefore, not invented by him.
British editor Marcus Allen, seen here, commented that getting to the moon is not the big problem. The Russians did this in 1959, by sending the 390 kg Luna 2 probe. The big problem is getting people there. Allen believes NASA sent robotic missions, primarily because radiation levels in space would be lethal to humans. We can add that all aircraft are built for use in our atmosphere, and it would be necessary to design different spaceships. The CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, did a secret operation that resulted in the disassembly of the Luna 2 probe, that was going to be displayed in Mexico. The agents diverted the truck carrying the probe, and during the night stayed inside it, disassembling, and photographing all the important details. Then, they got everything in order and left. A video from the series, The Truth Behind the Man on the Moon, showed the details of this operation. They did this because they knew the U.S. was far behind in the space race. This is the four-engine airplane Douglas DC-7, with propellers, launched in 1953. Late in 1958, Douglas and Boeing started selling four-engines jet airplanes, after many tests. That year, the U.S. already planned to send men to the Moon and Mars, using spacecraft with jet engines. Many people believed that the obstacles were overcome, but they did not. On January 20, 1961, John Kennedy took office as President of the United States, with Lyndon Johnson as Vice President. Thomas Glennan, who had been the administrator of NASA since 1958, resigned, which took effect on the same day.
Before his possession, Kennedy created a committee, headed by Professor of Electrical Engineering, Jerome Wiesner, to review everything related to missiles and space projects. Wiesner did a report, critical of NASA, especially the favoring of manned spaceflight, demanding much greater technical competence, and a redefinition of objectives. He was referring especially to the projects of manned voyages to land on the Moon. The influence of Wiesner soon decreased, because before taking office, Kennedy transferred responsibility for space affairs to Vice President Johnson, a longtime supporter of space programs in Congress, and one of the founders of NASA. Johnson was appointed to head the National Aeronautics and Space Council, which in the previous government was headed by President Eisenhower. Wiesner preferred a respected scientist-engineer to be the new administrator of NASA, but Johnson chose a politically experienced administrator, and Kennedy nominated James Webb, who had that profile. Probably everything would be better, in spending and credibility, if the opinion of Wiesner had prevailed. On April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union launched the Vostok 1 spacecraft, carrying astronaut Yuri Gagarin, who made a historic turn in Earth orbit, at 315 km altitude, in a flight of 1 hour and 48 minutes. 8 days after Gagarin's flight, Kennedy asked Johnson how the Soviets could be beaten in the space race. Perhaps to answer this question, in April, NASA Administrator James Webb and Vice Dryden were called to the White House. Dryden told Kennedy the following:
"Frankly, there is no way to reach the Soviets in orbital flights. A better idea would be to announce a program on the same scale as the Manhattan Project, that produced the atomic bomb. But the goal this time would be to put a man on the Moon in the next 10 years. He was not suggesting something new, because at that time NASA was already doing projects with the same objective."
On April 29, 1961, answering questions asked by Johnson, von Braun wrote that, between 1967 and 1968, the United States could send a manned mission to land on the Moon, and return safely. A few days later, James Webb, along with Secretary of Defense McNamara, sent a memo to Kennedy, ending with this sentence: "We suggest that our national space program include a manned mission to the Moon before the end of this decade." On May 5, 1961, Project Mercury successfully sent Alan Shepard on a 15-minute suborbital flight, inside a capsule, whose design is seen here. Other missions were made until 1963. After the flight, Robert Gilruth told Kennedy that the United States could send a manned mission to land on the Moon within 10 years. On the return to the Earth's surface, the capsule of the Mercury reached high speed, overheated its lower part, which was manufactured with appropriate materials. This part was heavy, and kept facing downwards during the descent. The images on the left show the representation of the descent, with overheating. On the right side, the sequence appears, with the capsule descending with a smaller parachute, and then with a larger parachute. The Apollo program's command module, supposedly, used a similar system. The Grumman Aircraft Company, on May 15, 1961, presented a summary project to NASA, affirming that the astronauts' mission to the Moon was possible. The comment almost certainly came from Thomas Kelly, who was born in 1929 and died in 2002. Thomas Kelly was an engineer, who wrote the 2001 book, Moonlander, detailing his and the Grumman Company's participation in the Apollo program. He was later called the father of the Lunar Module. He worked at Grumman from 1951 to 1956, and returned in 1959. According to Kelly, there was a group at Grumman, led by engineer Thomas Saniel, that was studying, together with NASA, the going to the Moon, through the Apollo program, created in July 1960. While the Apollo program attracted general attention, Thomas Saniel, and the other members of the group, were unable to come up with viable ideas. Because of this, Saniel began to miss work, simply to go out with his family. The Grumman manager, who was supervising them, noticed the general dismay, and took Kelly to join the group. Kelly and Saniel began to share responsibilities, but only Saniel had experience in space projects. According to Kelly, Saniel was destined for great accomplishments, as at the age of 27, he designed a capsule for the Mercury project, with an innovative solution. That's why Grumman won the contest, against 11 competitors, and was chosen by NASA to manufacture the capsule. However, NASA found that Grumman was overloaded with other projects, and signed the contract with McDonnell.
Even without knowing it, Thomas Saniel and Thomas Kelly became extremely important, because the Grumman had a high chance of being chosen to project and made the Lunar Module. The modules were the most problematic components of the Apollo program. The Saturn V rocket was supposed to carry the modules about 2% of the distance to the Moon. This accounted for only 1% of the total mission. Even with the missions simulated, it was necessary to design spaceships that appeared to perform well. Kelly adapted to that, and was an enthusiast of the idea of going to the Moon. Thomas Saniel was different, because he said that probably at the final Apollo program, the spacecrafts would not be similar to the ones they were studying. This because, even making good projects, they knew very little about what a flight to the Moon would be like. In other words, no one knew how to design a manned flight to land on the Moon. Saniel died in a car accident in December 1961. Posteriorly, they created the Thomas Saniel Award, ironically, given also to participants of the FAS.
The President Kennedy, addressing to Congress, on May 25, 1961, declared that he was determined to send men to the Moon through the Apollo program. See the declaration.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
In June 1961, Kennedy met with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. Kennedy tried to convince him to let the Soviet Union participate in the moon landing program with the United States. Khrushchev insisted that it would be necessary to first address the issue of banning nuclear tests. After that, there were some disagreements between these nations, which lasted for the next 2 years. That same year, 1961, Robert Geilruth was named director of the Center for Manned Spacecraft, responsible for planning all NASA manned flights, including the Gemini and Apollo missions, receiving more staff and larger facilities. He had doubts about the Apollo program being successful, as he felt that much testing would still be required. Still in 1961, NASA developed this design, with the basic concept of a set of modules, to be coupled to a Saturn V rocket. The command module remained almost unchanged in the Apollo program, but more functions were added, which reduced the space for astronauts. This quasi-draft was included in the request for proposals, sent to companies interested in implementing the spacecraft, as a guideline. This setup was for manned missions that would enter lunar orbit, and then return to Earth. This design could also serve for the manned lunar landing, but that would be left in the background at that moment.
By setting up the spacecrafts in this vague way, no one at NASA knew what a manned lunar landing should look like. They left the problem unresolved at this stage, even as contracts began to be signed to manufacture the larger rocket, and knew that the manned lunar landing was Kennedy's main objective.
From November 1961 until 1962, NASA released the names of companies selected for the design and manufacture of Apollo program components. Their names appear in the image. These components began to be produced, even with several important issues not yet defined. The contracts provided for possible modifications. The Lunar Module, which was the most problematic component, only had the definitive contract for design and manufacture by the Grumman Company, approved in February 1963. Even after the signing of contracts for the manufacture of most of the ships, other projects continued to be made. The lack of a rational solution for men going to the Moon is evident in this NASA drawing, published in Popular Mechanics in March 1962, showing a spacecraft leaving the Moon. It would have the same problems as similar spacecraft, including the need to fly like a flying saucer. This is the continuation of the study, seen in the previous screen. With the return to Earth, we can notice that they did not show the total trajectory. Still in Popular Mechanics from March 1962, we find this strange design, with another idea. Would be needed a space station, formed by the union of rockets, to launch the spacecraft to the Moon. Life magazine of April 1962, showed this spacecraft, which the article puts as programmed, that is, accepted by NASA, for landing on the Moon. The spacecraft would have only one propellant, which would complicate the maneuvers, as we commented previously, for similar ships.
There was controversy about which method would be used in the trip to the Moon. One method would use the massive Nova rocket. Another method would use a space station, from which the ships would depart. The controversy decreased with the order to manufacture the spacecrafts, based on the use of the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, done by Accent Stage. "We choose to go to the Moon," was the theme of President John Kennedy's speech, delivered in a stadium, on September 12, 1962, to a crowd. Kennedy, in the year before, already had set a goal of landing on the Moon, to demonstrate America's superiority in the space race. However, the majority of the American people were not in favor, due to the high cost, and because it was something only symbolic. According to the article, as seen here, President Kennedy had a secret recording system installed in the White House, with microphones to record his meetings, and phone calls in the Oval Office and Cabinet Room. A tape-recorded meeting was on September 18, 1963, in the Oval Office, with Kennedy and NASA Chief James Webb. Webb told Kennedy that the United States would not land on the Moon while he was president, even if he was re-elected in 1964, as expected. The Moon landing, Webb said, would not happen until 1969. On the recording, Kennedy's surprise and disappointment can be heard. After that, Kennedy would try to allocate less money to the trip to the Moon. With Kennedy in the presidency, there would probably be no Moon landing in 1969, real or simulated. 2 days after the meeting with James Webb, Kennedy again proposed that the Soviets participate in manned missions to the Moon. According to the article seen here, in September 1963, relations between the United States and the Soviets became cordial again. Kennedy proposed sending scientists to the Moon, as representatives of all countries, and not just one. For NASA, the idea was not viable, and Khrushchev did not respond. This photo is of November 16, 1963, showing John Kennedy and von Braun in the Cape Canaveral, Florida. The reactions of Kennedy to the Apollo program were apparently contradictory, with speeches proclaiming a determination to go to the Moon, to demonstrate the United States' superiority and, on the other side, trying to get the Soviets to participate in the program. It would not be interesting for the Soviets to participate in the Apollo program with the United States. To confirm this, it is enough to examine the poverty of NASA's ideas about going to the Moon, some of them shown here. Without the participation of the Soviets, Kennedy probably stayed in a difficult situation, because the trip to the Moon would be simulated. Jerome Wiesner continued to criticize NASA, but left the committee chair after Kennedy's death. John Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963.
This is a quote from Wiesner, commented, "Some problems are just too complicated for rational, logical solutions. They admit of insights, not answers." This phrase means that, despite the numerous ideas presented, NASA could not establish a rational plan for a manned landing on the Moon. In other words, they did not know how to make a manned trip to the Moon. This is another phrase from Wiesner: it is no longer a question of controlling a military-industrial complex, but rather, of keeping the United States from becoming a totally military culture. Probably this referred to the required military obedience.
Here we have two book covers, accusing Lyndon Johnson, by the assassination of John Kennedy. We can suppose that one of the reasons for the crime was the probable less allocate money to the trip to the moon. Johnson paid homage to the late Kennedy, but soon made the Apollo program a priority in his own administration. Johnson presented a budget to Congress just 8 weeks after the Kennedy assassination. He proposes cuts in defense, agriculture, and even the post office, but he asked more money for NASA.
This is the cover of a book, explaining the killing of President Kennedy. The author worked for Lyndon Johnson from 1948 to 1963. He informed that the murder of Kennedy was planned and supervised by Division 5 of the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Division 5 acted with the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, which was acting in name of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon, and other secret groups. We can notice that Bill Kaysing denounced the DIA as the executor of the farce. Everything seems complicated, and should be more investigated, but this is beyond our objective.
See more evidence of the fraud by reading the website indicated below, or watching the next video.